We've all been there sitting in a dark theater, watching a high-octane action film explode across the screen, thinking, this is too wild to be real. The gunfights, covert missions, double-crossing agents, and political cover-ups feel like the stuff of pure Hollywood fiction. But what if they weren't? What if some of those so-called fictional films were actually ripped from the headlines or worse, from classified reports? What if the storylines you assumed were dreamt up by over-imaginative screenwriters were actually reworked versions of operations no one was ever supposed to know about? The truth is, some action movies walk a razor-thin line between fiction and uncomfortable reality. And while studios love to claim inspired by true events when it helps the box office, there's another, more unsettling trend. The films that were based on real people, real missions, real secrets, but were never marketed that way. Not a single line in the credits. Not a single interview slip. Just silence. And yet, if you dig deep enough interviews with retired soldiers, ex-CIA operatives, or screenwriters who spoke a little too freely, you'll find eerie confirmations. You'll discover stories of films mirroring military black ops, foreign interventions, and real-life assassinations that were quietly reimagined for the screen. Sometimes the names were changed. Sometimes the dates were blurred. But the blueprint? The blueprint was never fiction. So why did the studios deny it? Legal pressure? Political threats? Or a quiet understanding that some stories are too close to the truth? Let's peel back the layers. These are 15 action films that told real stories, and then pretended they didn't. Fact has shown, The Dogs of War, 1,980. It looked like fiction mercenaries storming a corrupt African regime, bullets flying through jungles, and a cynical war photographer caught in the crossfire. But The Dogs of War was never just a war fantasy. Beneath its explosive exterior lies a script disturbingly close to real-world events the West still won't fully admit. Released in 1980, the film starred Christopher Walken as Jamie Shannon, a hardened mercenary hired to destabilize the fictional nation of Zangaro. The plot was officially loosely based on Frederick Forsyth's novel, but the novel itself was inspired by Forsyth's own time in Biafra, and by interviews he conducted with real mercs operating in post-colonial Africa. But here's the twist. Insiders have long alleged that Zangaro was a thinly veiled version of Equatorial Guinea, and that the film's entire third act mirrored Operation Hope, not a covert British-backed plan to replace the government of Francisco Macias. Several ex-intelligence officers claimed the film mirrored actual tactics used during the 1,970 seconds, down to the use of fake mining companies and rigged UN press credentials. So why the fictional framing? Because acknowledging that Western nations orchestrated real regime change in Africa would have blown open diplomatic scars that were still healing. To this day, The Dogs of War remains one of the most realistic depictions of mercenary operations ever captured on screen and one of the most persistently denied. But it wasn't the only time Hollywood repurposed a political coup as popcorn entertainment. Fact, #2. Eye of the Eagle, 1,987. It played like a cheap VHS thrill ride. Explosions, jungle warfare, and rogue soldiers running covert missions. But Eye of the Eagle wasn't just another Filipino-shot B-movie, it was eerily close to real Black Ops missions the U.S. once conducted and desperately tried to forget. Directed by Cirio H. Santiago, a legend in low-budget action, the film follows a U.S. commando tracking down a rogue platoon during the Vietnam War. But Vietnam isn't where the real story lies. Several military historians have pointed out uncanny similarities between the plot of Eye of the Eagle and Operation White Star, a top-secret CIA Army collaboration in Laos, a country the U.S. officially claimed neutrality in throughout the war. According to reports declassified years later, small U.S. units did operate deep in Laos, engaging in missions almost identical to the ones portrayed in the film. Unauthorized combat, sabotage, and deep retrieval of rogue elements. Even the terrain, coded language, and political deniability match too perfectly. While Eye of the Eagle never once mentions Laos, and no studio marketing connected it to real history, veterans of Southeast Asian operations took notice. A former Green Beret anonymously claimed in a military forum that Someone either guessed too well or knew exactly what they were writing. It raises the question, was this fiction or a fictionalized confession? And if so, how many more so-called Vietnam films were actually about wars fought off the books? Fact. #3. The President's Man, 2000. It aired on network television, starred Chuck Norris, and seemed like harmless action fluff. But buried beneath The President's Man was a far murkier reality, one that aligned uncomfortably well with persistent rumors about a real, deniable presidential hit team. The film tells the story of Joshua McCord, a veteran operative who secretly carries out high-risk missions for the President of the United States, entirely off the books. The movie treats it as light patriotism, but military insiders have long claimed the character mirrors real individuals who operated under presidential findings, classified directives that authorize covert missions without congressional oversight. What makes it stranger is that the screenwriter, Norris himself, hinted in multiple interviews that he based McCord on someone he met through military friends. That comment was quickly walked back in press circuits, but it sparked speculation in intelligence forums. One name kept surfacing: Billy Waugh, a decorated CIA operator rumored to have conducted missions directly under presidential authority throughout the 80 seconds and 90 seconds. Waugh's own memoir was published later, and while he never named a film, some passages describing unnamed media distortions sound eerily like The President's Man. The film never admitted any connection to real figures. No disclaimer, no credit, just a perfectly packaged fictional narrative that may have sanitized one of the U.S. government's most morally ambiguous capabilities. And what better way to normalize a Black Ops truth than to hide it in plain sight on primetime TV? Fact Shabaka Arba. Final mission. 1984. At first glance, Final Mission seems like yet another post-Vietnam exploitation, flick a lone soldier, betrayal, a bloody path of vengeance. But beneath its grindhouse aesthetics lies a surprisingly accurate reflection of a very real fracture inside the U.S. military that no one wanted to talk about. Released in 1984, the film follows Sergeant Greg Colton, a Green Beret betrayed by his own and hunted by corrupt military officials. What set it apart wasn't just the violence, it was the eerie parallels to real incidents of internal rebellion among returning soldiers, especially during the late 70 seconds, when disillusionment with the war had reached a boiling point. Multiple military historians have noted the resemblance between Colton's arc and the true story of David Freeman, a decorated Vietnam veteran who went AWOL in 1978 and later led an armed standoff against federal agents, citing betrayal by command. His writings, uncovered posthumously, contain verbatim phrases spoken by Colton in the film despite the script, never crediting any source. What's more, production notes reveal that screenwriter Cirio Santiago interviewed multiple veterans in the Philippines who had fled court-martial by hiding in remote provinces. Their stories of being disowned by command eerily mirror the film's central themes. Why hide the inspiration? Because to acknowledge it would have meant confronting a darker narrative, that not all American soldiers returned home as heroes, and some turned against the very system they fought for. Final Mission never claimed to be based on real events. But ask the right veterans, and you'll hear. It's more real than anyone wanted to admit. Fact #5. The Hitman, 1991. On paper, The Hitman is straightforward revenge fiction. A cop left for dead returns as a shadowy assassin to clean up corruption. But the deeper you look, the clearer it becomes. This wasn't just a made-up vigilante fantasy. It's eerily close to a real Black Ops figure the government tried to erase. Released in 1991, the film stars Chuck Norris as Cliff Garrett, an undercover cop shot by his own partners and secretly revived by the government to become a hitman operating under a false identity. Sounds outlandish until you compare it to Project Phoenix, the controversial CIA assassination program during the Vietnam War, and more specifically, one of its alleged rogue operatives, the man only known by his call sign, Tomahawk. Unsealed records in the early 2000s reference a highly trained asset who faked his own death after being outed, only to resurface in Europe as part of a freelance counter-intel team. Several details match. The betrayal by fellow agents, the false ID, and the cleanup operations against former employers gone rogue. Norris never acknowledged this connection, but insiders believe the hitman was loosely based on Tomahawk's case file leaked years earlier in obscure military literature and later suppressed. Some even believe the film served as controlled disinformation, a way to discredit real leaks by turning them into pulp entertainment. It's not the first time Hollywood has reframed covert truth as fiction, but the hitman might be one of the clearest examples of an actual assassin's life turned into cinematic camouflage. The real question is, who greenlit the script? Fact#6, Act of Valor, 2012. Marketed as a patriotic tribute, Act of Valor became a unique entry in action cinema for casting real Navy SEALs as its stars. But what few knew at the time was that the script wasn't just fiction with a dose of realism, it was reportedly built from actual mission debriefs, lightly disguised for the screen. The 2012 film follows an elite SEAL team executing a series of complex operations across the globe. Audiences were told the plot was fictional, albeit inspired by true acts of heroism. But according to a whistleblower within the Department of Defense, at least 2 full sequences in the film were near-verbatim recreations of classified mission logs, including one rescue operation in the Philippines and a double-tap extraction in Somalia. Even more curious, prior to the film's release, the Pentagon quietly tightened clearance procedures for former SEALs engaging with media. This move, documented by military watchdog groups, came just months after producers of Act of Valor reportedly met with former operators to consult on the realism. While the filmmakers maintained plausible deniability, critics within the intelligence community saw it differently. One even remarked anonymously, "That wasn't a movie, it was a selective confession." In blending real tactics, real personnel, and real events into a dramatized package, Act of Valor blurred the line between propaganda, documentation, and entertainment. The film may have inspired patriotism, but it also quietly leaked a glimpse into missions that were never supposed to see daylight. And no one, not the Pentagon, not the studio, ever acknowledged which parts were real. Fact#7, Navy SEALs 1990. With its high-octane pace and over-the-top heroics, Navy SEALs looked like just another testosterone-fueled action flick of the early 90 seconds. Critics panned it. Viewers loved it. But buried under the bombastic dialogue and gung-ho patriotism was a skeleton of a story too similar to real-life operations to be accidental. The plot follows a team of elite SEALs tasked with intercepting stolen Stinger missiles in the Middle East, a mission that involves urban warfare, hostage rescue, and stealth insertion. But military analysts and former operators have long noted the script's uncanny parallels to Operation Goldenrod, a covert 1987 mission where U.S. forces abducted a suspected terrorist arms dealer from international territory. Both involve SEAL insertions with diplomatic deniability, retrieval of dangerous missile tech, and a geopolitical setup nearly identical to early Middle Eastern interventions. What makes it harder to ignore is the involvement of actual Navy SEALs as advisors on set. One consultant later admitted in a memoir that some of the scenes were storyboards we once planned for real. The book was quietly pulled from print within a year. The U.S. Navy officially distanced itself from the final film, citing creative liberties. But the details remained oddly consistent with insider accounts. Why disown something so close to the truth? Because sometimes even a bad movie says too much. Fact#7, Executive Decision, 1996. Terrorists hijack a commercial airliner. A secret military unit boards mid-air. Casualties ensue. It's a gripping premise, and one that Executive Decision sold as original. But aviation security experts point out, this film's narrative had already played out behind closed doors, long before it hit theaters. Released in 1996, the film eerily mirrors the real 1984 exercise Skyhook Echo, a highly classified U.S. test where Delta Force simulated boarding a hijacked plane mid-flight using a modified stealth module. That simulation, never declassified in full, reportedly ended with accidental decompression, and a failed extraction details reflected with alarming accuracy in the movie's opening scenes. What's more unsettling, an internal FAA document from 1997 expressed concern that executive decision had lifted exact tactical concepts previously reviewed under classified air intervention protocols. While the source of that leak was never identified, screenwriters suddenly ceased giving interviews shortly after the film's release. The studio maintained it was pure fiction. But insiders claimed the film's portrayal of dark flight operations was too informed, citing specific dialogue that matched redacted training transcripts. Was it coincidence or clearance violation? No one knows for sure. But one thing's clear. Executive decision didn't just thrill audiences, it quietly resurfaced a scenario the government had hoped to bury. Fact Shabak Tesa. Behind Enemy Lines, Elfan Wawahid. Marketed as a fictional tale of survival, Behind Enemy Lines told the story of a downed Navy pilot navigating hostile territory alone, pursued by enemies and bureaucracy alike. What it didn't tell you? The plot was blatantly lifted from the real-life experience of Lieutenant Scott O'Grady without his permission. In 1995, O'Grady was shot down over Bosnia during a NATO mission. He survived for 6 harrowing days using evasion techniques before being rescued by U.S. Marines. The incident was widely covered, but the official story was carefully sanitized. When Behind Enemy Lines debuted in 2001, O'Grady was stunned. He recognized the timeline, the escape methods, even the personal tension between the pilot and command. But the filmmakers never consulted him. He filed a lawsuit, accusing the studio of profiting off his trauma without acknowledgement. The studio claimed the film was only loosely inspired. Here's where it gets murkier. Several Pentagon advisors on the film were reportedly the same men who debriefed O'Grady after his rescue, and key details like his use of dead zones and decoy flares were previously classified. So how did they end up in a Hollywood script? Some speculate the film was an unofficial reframing of O'Grady's ordeal, turning a politically delicate mission into palatable fiction, while sidestepping the need to credit or compensate him. In the end, the lawsuit settled quietly. The truth? Not so much. Fact Hassan 0. The Delta Force, 1986. It opens with a hijacked plane, a shadowy group of Middle Eastern terrorists, and a last-minute rescue by elite American commandos. The Delta Force was patriotic, pulpy, and absurdly watchable. But beneath the flag-waving theatrics lies a disturbing truth. The film didn't just draw inspiration from reality, it nearly recreated it. The hijacking scenario closely mirrors the TWA Flight 847 crisis of 1985, where terrorists held over 100 hostages and killed a U.S. Navy diver before negotiating for demands. Chuck Norris's character leads a daring rescue on foreign soil, something the real Delta Force was rumored to have planned but never executed, due to political complications. What the film shows, a mid-air storming, explosive breach, and split-second evacuation aligns uncannily with leaked portions of a scrubbed military operation dubbed Operation Crescent Fire. Though never publicly confirmed, documents revealed during a 1993 Pentagon audit suggested that Delta had prepared for an airborne intervention nearly identical to the film's climax. The kicker? The screenwriters had access to military consultants who had worked on hostage rescue simulations at the time. One anonymous source later said, "We pitched the plan." The politicians blinked. Hollywood didn't. While no one involved in the Delta Force openly admitted to lifting a shelved military playbook, the parallels were too detailed for coincidence. Sometimes, what you see in theaters isn't fantasy, it's a glimpse into what almost happened. Fact Hassonon, Proof of Life, 2000. Kidnapping for Ransom, Corporate Secrets, Jungle Warfare. Proof of Life positioned itself as a thriller rooted in emotional stakes. But the plot's gritty realism, especially its portrayal of hostage extraction, drew attention for all the wrong reasons. Because it echoed a real rescue mission the public never heard about. In the film, Russell Crowe plays a former SAS operative turned negotiator, helping extract a kidnapped American from a guerrilla-controlled region in Latin America. The narrative feels grounded, almost procedural, And that's because, according to whistleblowers, it was built around a 1,996 off-the-books rescue carried out by ex-special forces and private contractors in Colombia. That real incident involved a U.S. engineer kidnapped by the FARC. Officially, no rescue occurred, only negotiations. But independent journalists reported a covert team was inserted through Brazil to retrieve the hostage by force, something U.S. agencies still deny. The film features an almost identical route of insertion, weapon loadouts, and even a climactic jungle shootout at an isolated camp, details too specific to be entirely fictional. Even more suspicious, the film's technical advisor was a real ex-AS officer known for operating in Colombia. He never confirmed the link, but military intelligence sources claimed the production heavily borrowed from sensitive after-action reports. The studio? Silent. The governments involved? Denial. But the people who lived those missions recognized themselves in every frame. Fact Shabak Wahdathnan, Big Game, Alfan wa Arba'ati Ashar. It was marketed as an over-the-top action adventure. The U.S. president shot down over Finland, rescued by a teenage hunter with a bow. Big Game wore its ridiculousness proudly. But buried inside the absurdity was a strange truth, one tied to a real emergency scenario that nearly occurred. In 2008, NORAD ran a contingency exercise simulating the crash of Air Force One over northern Europe due to satellite spoofing and electronic interference. The scenario included the president surviving in a remote forest and an emergency extraction by a Scandinavian special ops unit. That document was never meant for public eyes. Yet Big Game's plot mimics it disturbingly well. From the rural setting and hostile terrain to the idea of using non-military local aid for evasion, the resemblance is uncanny. Critics assumed it was coincidence until details from NORAD's exercise leaked in 2015 via a cybersecurity breach. Suddenly, a ridiculous action movie didn't feel so ridiculous anymore. No one in the U.S. government commented. The Finnish Film Board dismissed it as creative invention. But cybersecurity experts found a timeline that matched too well. The screenwriters began development just months after that exercise concluded. Was it coincidence? Or was a classified scenario passed along to Hollywood to gauge public reaction in the most absurd way possible? If the world ever learns what really inspired Big Game, we might laugh a little less. Fact, Yersan. Olympus has fallen. Arlene Yassarn. A sudden military-style assault on the White House. Communications jammed. A lone operative fights through chaos to save the president. To most, Olympus Has Fallen was just testosterone-heavy fiction. But behind its explosive spectacle was a blueprint lifted from a real crisis scenario once deemed too dangerous to test. In 2010, a leaked Pentagon simulation detailed a coordinated assault on Washington by foreign operatives posing as diplomats. The scenario, codenamed Black Garden, involved jamming security systems, storming the West Wing, and exploiting a shift-change window, every beat reflected in Olympus Has Fallen's plot. While the movie shifted villains from one nationality to another, experts noticed the tactical maneuvers, including the use of satellite blind spots and hijacked civilian aircraft, were straight from the actual war game. The Department of Homeland Security made no public statement, but insiders noted that multiple elements shown in the film matched protocols later removed from interagency drills, as if the movie had accidentally exposed operational flaws. One security analyst even warned, if a screenwriter guessed all that, they should be in intelligence, not Hollywood. To this day, no one involved in the film has acknowledged a real-world source. And maybe that's the point. Because when fiction mirrors classified exercises too precisely, denial becomes the only option. Fact Shabak Wahda Arba'a, Green Zone, Alfan wa Ashara. Green Zone was billed as a fictional story set in the chaos of post-invasion Iraq, an action thriller with Matt Damon at the center. But to those who were actually there, the film felt uncomfortably familiar, because much of it was. The film follows a U.S. officer uncovering a false WMD narrative while rogue intelligence circles scramble to cover it up. Sounds like a stretch until you compare it to the actual saga of Army Chief Warrant Officer Richard Monty Gonzalez, who led early WMD site inspections and repeatedly contradicted official claims in 2003. Gonzalez's reports were buried, and he was later reassigned. He never went public. But former Pentagon staffers revealed the film's military advisor had access to internal DIA memos, ones that detailed suppressed findings almost line for line with scenes in the script. Universal Studios labeled the film fiction inspired by the fog of war. But the protagonist's backstory, mission targets, and even his clashes with an embedded CIA operative too closely mirrored real logs. The twist? Gonzalez was offered a chance to consult. He refused. "You already told my story," he reportedly said, without ever asking. So while Green Zone was dismissed by critics as paranoid fantasy, it might have been the closest Hollywood ever got to publicly dramatizing a buried military whistleblower. Fact Hash and 5, The Kingdom, 2007. A bombing, an off-the-books investigation. U.S. agents clashing with foreign allies in the shadows of Saudi Arabia. The Kingdom walked a thin line between diplomacy and vengeance, but what few viewers knew is that its script was a barely disguised version of a mission that actually unfolded and ended very differently. In 2004, a real bombing in Riyadh targeted a Western compound. Official reports claimed full cooperation between Saudi and U.S. agencies. But insiders from the Bureau of Diplomatic Security revealed a different story. A team of U.S. operatives launched an unauthorized parallel investigation, frustrated by red tape and misinformation. The mission was ultimately shut down before conclusions were made public. But the Kingdom plays it out to the end, complete with covert surveillance, internal betrayal, and a private firefight in the desert. Even more intriguing, the film's technical advisor was a former FBI agent stationed in the Gulf at the time of the real attack. He never acknowledged any direct connection, but intelligence circles quietly labeled the movie as fictionalized debriefing. The most damning clue? The film's ending. A line whispered by two opposing sides, "We're gonna kill them all." It was reportedly transcribed verbatim from a classified field recording. So, was the Kingdom entertainment? Or was it revenge dressed as fiction? Bonus fact: Shadow Company, 1985, unmade. This one didn't make the top 15, but it might just be the strangest of all. In 1985, a script titled Shadow Company began circulating through Hollywood. Penned by Shane Black and Fred Decker, the screenplay told the story of a Vietnam veteran who returns from the dead literally to join a group of reanimated super soldiers gone rogue. It was marketed as a horror-action hybrid. The project gained momentum, with John Carpenter attached to direct and Walter Hill set to produce. Then, silence. The film was never made. No official cancellation, no scandal, just vanished. Years later, when the script leaked online, researchers noticed something odd. Many of the locations, mission profiles, and even squad nicknames matched real files from Project Orion, a rumored Department of Defense program exploring biochemical experimentation on captured soldiers during the final years of the Vietnam War. A 1,993 FOIA request uncovered fragmented reports of post-mortem stimulation trials conducted at covert sites in Cambodia and Laos language that eerily mirrored lines from Shadow Company's second act. While most dismissed the similarities as coincidence or intentional shock tactics, one former military advisor involved in early drafts stated in a podcast, "We didn't make that up. We were told to tone it down." And so what happened to the movie? Was it shelved for being too crazy? Or because it got too close to a classified narrative that needed to stay buried? In a Hollywood full of conspiracy thrillers, Shadow Company was fiction, until it wasn't. Some stories are buried under layers of fiction. Others wear just enough camouflage to pass unnoticed. But sometimes, the truth doesn't need to be hidden, it just needs to be dismissed as entertainment. You've seen the bullets, the betrayals, the missions that never happened. Now ask yourself, how much of what we call fiction was actually a redacted reality? Which of these films do you believe crossed the line between cinematic invention and historical omission? And more importantly, what other truths are still playing in plain sight?